Hey guys, Dr. Sitzel here. So we just covered the idea of trade, specialization, and gains from trade, several key and important ideas in economics. What I want to present now is a condensation of the speech presented by an economist named Don Boudreaux out of George Mason University. And he presents 10 reasons that he calls the elemental case for free trade, and then accompanies them with 7 reasons that we shouldn't restrict trade and sort of counter arguments to common anti-trade arguments. So the first argument that Dr. Boudreaux makes is that political borders should not cause different kinds of trade to be treated differently. So we're pretty accustomed to things like buy local, right? And by buy local, we often mean buy within the same country or the same state or even the same county, right? But that might go across city borders or county lines or state lines, and you're trading with people that are across political borders, and the buy local argument sort of boils down to you shouldn't cross national borders, but you should be happy to cross city, county, and state borders. Remember that in some sense, political borders are, I don't want to call them arbitrary because it's not quite the word, but in the function of trade, they are arbitrary. And so your benefits that you'd be get from trading across national borders aren't any different than the benefits that you'd be getting from trading with neighbors in other cases. And in fact, I encourage us to think about people elsewhere in the world that are in different nations and live very different lives from us are actually, in a very serious and real way, they are our neighbors. Okay, second idea here is that all economic activity is ultimately justified by how much it enables us to expand our consumption and not how much it expands our production. And this goes back to that idea that we've presented elsewhere in this class, right? That value is, at the end of the day, both marginal and subjective, which is to say, production is an important means, and it often provides its own type of value. We feel good about ourselves for having been productive, right? But the things that we're producing them as a means to an end, and that end is consumption. So as we saw in the last video, trade enables more consumption without using any more resources. And so it expands production and thereby expands consumption in a way that doesn't require us to do anything but rearrange our patterns, our choices that we make for ourselves. This brings us to an idea that we've met several times before in this class, but I'm going to keep talking about it, is this labor theory of value. And this is one of the things that we want to really attack in this class and be reminded that this isn't a useful way to think about the world. And the reason that I bring that up is because the alternative argument to subjective and marginal value, consumption being the end, is that you don't really care how hard it is to make a particular thing. You care what that individual value is to you in the situation that you're in. So in the situation that you're in is that marginal idea, right? Let's take an example. I have a silly example written down here, right? So my wife is an excellent cook, but also a great baker, and she makes a beautiful cake, and she does it in an hour. Right, and then suppose it takes me 2 days, and I go out in the garage and I scoop up all the sawdust because my wife is also an excellent carpenter, and I like to dabble out there, and I put it together and I make you a nice sawdust and nail cake, and it takes 2 days to make, where my wife only took 2 hours to make her beautiful chocolate cake. Which one has more value? This drives home the point that you really don't care how hard it is to make something. You care which of your ordered wants does this satisfy, and how valuable is the satisfaction of that particular want. This harkens back all the way to our market process videos. Okay, next we're going to have a series of arguments about specialization that I think are pretty insightful. The first is that specialization expands output, and that's what we saw in the trade video from before, is that by doing nothing but rearranging how it is that we specialize, we can produce more, right? The important lesson here, and what Dr. Boudreaux really draws out, is that the greater the specialization, the greater the output. So there's sort of, more you specialize, the better you can get at a specialized set of tasks, right? So let's think about the medical field. You might only have general practitioners in a small area, and they might specialize in some things, sort of, say there's 2 or 3 doctors, and one might do children, and one might do adults, and one might do elderly people, etc., and they might specialize a little bit. Now imagine a bigger market right? Where now we have some people that specialize on heart surgery and some that specialize on ear, nose, and throat. They get really good at these things. And, well, of course, one of the difficulties in producing medicine is that you have to keep up with all this research. The more general your work is, the more things you have to know about, the less in-depth you can go to keep up with the particular medical research. If you have a doctor and maybe they're focused on your gut biome, right? If they're an expert and a specialist in that area, they can go to different conferences, they can talk to people that are researching in that field, and they can figure out how to deal with that. If they're a general practitioner, they also have to keep up with what's the latest techniques on splinting a broken arm, what are the latest techniques on maybe delivering a baby or something. Whereas if you actually have ER doctors and you actually have OBGYNs, etc., they can focus on all these different things and they can really increase the output, right? The quality of the medical care that's happening. Okay, next, specialization requires trade, right? And this is a point I made multiple times in the past video, so I won't linger on it, except to say you can't specialize if you can't trade. By definition, if I can't trade with anyone, if I were the only one stranded on a desert island, I would have to do it all. And in that case, what's my output going to be? It's going to be just catching fish and just boiling water and just making a lean-to to stay out of the weather, right? But if there's 10,000 other people, or somebody can focus on making houses and somebody can focus on making boats and somebody can focus on fishing, and all of a sudden I go from living an existence where it's all I can do to survive to where now it might be a nice island city and a destination place for people to visit, even under the exact same weather and geological conditions. Okay. Fifth, specialization increases with the size of the market. So the more consumers and producers, the more specialization is available. This is an idea that I sort of just touched on with the thought of the island. Another way to say this, though, is that trade increases the size of the market. So by trading, right, if you were in a city and all of a sudden you opened up a trade line to another city, it's kind of an idea hard for you and me to grasp because we're so used to just being able to trade with whomever we want because the world is so well connected these days. Remember that harkens back to like the iPencil idea. But imagine in a past time in life where we might not travel very far or very efficiently, and all of a sudden you discovered, hey, there's a city just over the mountain and they're good at things that we're not good at, and we open up trade. Both parts are going to be both parties are going to be made better off. Okay, sixth point, increasing the size of the market leads to increasing the returns. So doubling the size of people who trade with each other causes more than double the economic growth. There's this compounding effect of specialization. And so you could imagine if we were doing one of those numerical examples that we did in the previous video, what if we added a third person and they could focus on a third category? You're made better off in a way that's not just sort of linear, right? So this is because that specialization can sort of be ever expanding. Okay, 7, there's no limit to the degree to which labor can specialize. So the expansion of trade to those outside our nation improves our lives as much as expanding our trade to other states. Right, so in theory, I guess if we found aliens who were willing to trade with us and they opened up a trade station on Mars, we'd all be made better off. Presumably they'd be good at things or make things or have access to resources that we wouldn't otherwise have. Okay, turning a little bit now that we've talked about specialization and returns to scale. Number 8, economic competition is good and it works just as effectively across as within borders, which is to say economic competition is good because it disciplines the market, it prevents us from being taken advantage of, and if you live in a remote city and you can't trade with anyone else and there's one particular person that does whatever, maybe performs medical surgeries, and you only have access to that one person, then they don't have the discipline of the market imposed on them quite as strictly as if you could easily travel to another city. And this, of course, works just as well, maybe even better in some ways, as you open up the geographic area, because you might get access to different cultural norms that would be really powerful and positive. Not to say that all contact with new cultures is always good, obviously not, but there can be things in different areas, different ways to think about things and approach things that would really improve our trade. And that coming in the form of economic competition causes us to have a wider variety of things. Think back to that market process video. We said adding a camera to a cell phone is a form of competition. The more we compete, the more people competing, the more it is that we will see innovations and developments that improve the quality, type, and availability of the products that we have. Number 9, the ultimate resource is human beings and human creativity. So human creativity is getting more and more scarce. We know this because labor is being paid 60 times what it was in 1790. So we've seen just a dramatic increase in human labor. And remember, that's measuring the marginal value of things. Meanwhile, other productive resources are less scarce. In fact, economist Andrew McAfee shows that we're actually decoupling production, physical production, from land use. We're actually returning back to a state of nature, land mass the size of the state of Washington every year. I want to say since I forget the exact number. The work of Andrew McAfee is very interesting and worth exploring. These resources are getting less and less scarce. We're making more and more efficient use of them, and we're finding replacements for the type of resources that are hard to get, expensive to get. We're finding replacements for them. A good example of this, for example, might be renewable energy. And it's good to bear in mind that free trade maximizes the ability of people both to contribute their own creativity and effort to the global economy and to tap into the creativity and effort of billions of other resources that reside elsewhere in the world. Most importantly, other people, right? So the most important thing, actually had a conversation just like this with a colleague today who said, well, what happens if somebody's born innately smarter than the rest of us? And I said, well, they'll make us better off, because if we're engaged in free trade, if we have free society, and we're committed to actual ideals of freedom, then when somebody comes into the world that is brilliant, that's talented, we're made better off because they won't extract from us, right? They'll be able to specialize and create a higher level of output, and because we allow them to specialize in what it is that they're good at, and we trade with them, then we will get more out of it, right? I use the example of Louis Pasteur, right, who discovered microorganisms cause disease, right? Imagine if that person, instead of being able to focus on being a scientist in what would obviously eventually become microbiology, instead that individual was having to grow his own crops and raise his own sheep and pick his own cherries. He would have never come up with that idea. The world would be much, much worse off. Okay, 10, restrictions on trade are driven by special interest group politics. I think the nice thing about teaching this in this day and age is I barely need to defend that anymore. It's pretty clear that lobbyists, special interest groups, and whatnot actually form and shape policy. And restrictions on trade is no different than that. And we could point to myriad examples from every political party in the world probably. And the reasons that we would want to restrict trade from a political perspective have nothing to do with making any of the people involved in the trade better off. How do we know that? Because trade is mutually beneficial. So if you're stopping something that makes people better off, you're making them worse off by comparison. If in my lunch I have 2 cookies, and if in your lunch you have 2 apples, and I say, hey, I'll trade you an apple for a cookie. Now I have an apple and a cookie, and you have an apple and a cookie, and we would both prefer the mix of those 2 things to having just one or the other. We're mutually beneficial. If somebody comes and says, hey, no trading food during lunchtime, I'm worse off because the first cookie is delicious, but the second cookie is not nearly as good, and it sure would be nice to have a crisp apple instead. And your first apple is delicious, but maybe you'd rather have a sweet treat to go with your lunch instead of a second apple. Restricting trade made everyone worse off in that case. Okay, 11th, this is an idea we've already met before in this class, right? Individuals, not collectives, act. Another way to say that is countries don't trade with each other, people trade with people. So remember, you're not stopping trade between the U.S. and China, perhaps. Instead, you're stopping trade between an individual living somewhere in the United States and individuals living somewhere in China. Now, maybe China isn't the best example of that because they actually treat their government as a separate entity that might own many of the pieces of production. That doesn't invalidate the idea that individuals act, but in this case, we do want to remember that people trade with people, not countries trade with each other. Okay, let's turn the page now to arguments against trade restrictions. There's several arguments here, right? One is that free trade causes jobs to be lost. But this isn't true. Instead, free trade doesn't cause a net loss of jobs. So any change of consumer spending causes some jobs to be lost in some places, but they create jobs in other places. Trade across borders is no different, trade across international borders is no different than trade across state borders, right? The jobs lost today to imports are replaced tomorrow by other types of jobs. And this would just almost be self-evident, right? Second, the jobs lost to international trade are the ones that we're at a comparative disadvantage in. The opportunity cost must have been higher for us to do it than for individuals to do it. So the exact reasons that there are specialization and gains from trade in the previous video is the exact reasons that the jobs that go along with those videos go along with the lesson from that video are better off being done somewhere else so that we can focus on the things that we are good at as individuals and as countries. Okay, so the jobs that we gain are actually jobs that we're at a comparative advantage in, right? So suppose that you worry that the loss of particular jobs today can't be made up for a creation of new jobs. Consider that in 1950, the size of the U.S. workforce contained roughly 60 million people with 57 million jobs. The unemployment rate was 5.3. Today, the size of the U.S. workforce is about 160 million, about 152 million jobs. It's a little bit of a typo there. Say million. In 66 years, the number of workers and the number of jobs in America have each increased by a bit more than 150%. The rate of unemployment is a not too shabby 5%, and that's, I think, a 2016 number, right? It's actually gone even lower since then, and obviously there are short-term fluctuations, so I won't make a statement about what that is, but we're roughly in that same territory, and we've engaged in more trade than ever during that time period. Combining these two ideas brings us to an important point, which is that protectionism actually protects inferior jobs. So it doesn't protect good jobs, it protects the bad jobs. So we actually want trade so that we can get the jobs that we're good at. We need to get the jobs that we have a comparative advantage in. Okay. Another objection to free trade is that it's undesirable if it creates a trade deficit. And this is really just a poor way to think about trade, because another way to think about trade is what we call a capital surplus. So try this next time you see trade deficit in the news and just replace that with the word capital surplus, and see if the news story is quite as scary. Every cent of a U.S. trade deficit is a cent invested by foreigners in American or in dollar-denominated assets. These investments not only return dollars to the U.S., they also signal that the U.S. is an attractive and safe place to invest. Further, by enlarging our capital stock, they enrich us, which is to say, how do you get richer? Well, it's in part by being more productive. How do you end up more productive? That's by having more things at your disposal to produce things with, right? And so by investing in us, they put money into our businesses, which allow us to produce more. So it's a very good thing. It's a very good thing to be running a trade deficit, which is another way to say it's a very good thing to be running a capital surplus. Okay, our sixth argument against trade restrictions is that high-wage Americans can't compete with low-wage foreigners. But we've got to remember that wages reflect productivity. That's the marginal value argument that we've seen several times before. Another way to say we can't compete with low-wage foreigners is to say we can't compete with low-productivity foreigners. This is obviously false. And I don't think I've said this yet before in this class, but another thing to think about, right, is that labor is just like any other resource. We want to conserve it. You don't want to spend any more labor than you have to produce something, because that's labor that could be used to produce something else and give us more output. So you really don't have much to fear if you really do think that the foreigners in a different situation are low wage. That's a reflection of their productivity. And if we want to move production somewhere where there is lower productivity, that must signal something about the relative comparative advantages involved. Okay, finally, one last argument against trade restrictions is to point out that any type of trade restriction is to tell you how you can and cannot spend your money. And so we have sort of a philosophical argument here, which is money you make should be money your friend is free to spend as you choose. Your neighbor has no more claim on your money than someone in another nation. So the buy local argument is especially silly if you say, well, you have to spend your money on goods made in another country.